Golden child bro got my fiancée pregnant, and our parents chose him. 4 years later, they lost. Elias traced the grain of the mahogany desk, the polished surface reflecting the muted afternoon light filtering through the bay window. His childhood home was a monument to curated success, a testament to his parents' unwavering pursuit of appearances, a pursuit that always seemed to favor Julian, his older brother, who effortlessly embodied the image of the golden child, radiating charisma and confidence while Elias quietly excelled, finding solace in the precision of architecture. The tangible results of his efforts, a stark contrast to Julian's fleeting achievements. The house itself felt less like a home and more like a stage, each room meticulously arranged to project an illusion of perfect harmony, a harmony Elias increasingly felt excluded from, a subtle dissonance that hummed beneath the surface of every family gathering, a feeling amplified by his engagement to Clara, a woman who seemed to genuinely appreciate his quiet nature, a haven from the constant comparison. Yet, even in his happiness, a shadow of unease lingered, a premonition that the carefully constructed facade of their lives was fragile, susceptible to cracks he couldn't yet see, a feeling that something, somewhere, was about to shift. Clara's laughter echoed through the sun-drenched kitchen as she meticulously arranged a bouquet of wildflowers, her hands moving with a grace that always captivated Elias, a warmth radiating from her that seemed to melt away his anxieties. Their connection had blossomed slowly, built on shared passions for art and literature, a mutual understanding that transcended words, a quiet intimacy that felt profoundly safe. Yet even in this idyllic moment, Elias couldn't shake a subtle awareness of Julian's presence, a lingering glance, a casually placed hand on Clara's arm during a recent family dinner, gestures that he initially dismissed as brotherly affection, but now seemed imbued with a different energy, a subtle undercurrent of something unspoken, something that stirred a nascent discomfort within him. He watched Clara now, her brow furrowed in concentration as she adjusted a single stem, and a strange sense of protectiveness washed over him, a desire to shield her from any potential harm, a feeling that was both irrational and deeply unsettling, a premonition that their happiness was not as secure as it seemed, a fragile bloom threatened by an unseen storm. The air in the living room felt thick with unspoken tension as Elias recounted a seemingly innocuous conversation he'd overheard between Julian and Clara, a conversation filled with playful banter and shared inside jokes, details that felt strangely intimate, a subtle shift in their dynamic that he couldn't quite decipher. His parents, seated opposite him, dismissed his concerns with practiced ease, attributing his anxieties to pre-wedding jitters, subtly implying that he was being overly sensitive. His mother's smile felt strained, her eyes avoiding his gaze, while his father offered a patronizing pat on the shoulder, assuring him that Julian would never intentionally hurt him, a reassurance that felt hollow and insincere. Elias felt a surge of frustration, a sense of being unheard and invalidated, his voice trembling as he attempted to articulate his unease, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears, lost in the carefully constructed narrative of family harmony, a narrative that prioritized appearances over genuine connection, a narrative that consistently favored Julian, casting Elias as the perpetually anxious and insecure younger brother, a role he had long since resigned himself to. But now, with Clara at stake, he found himself unwilling to accept. The world tilted on its axis with a simple confirmation, a single sentence uttered by Clara, her voice barely a whisper, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. She was pregnant. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Elias. Joy, disbelief, and a chilling dread that settled deep in his bones. The initial euphoria quickly dissipated, replaced by a gnawing suspicion that Julian was the father. The thought was a monstrous intrusion, a betrayal of everything he believed in. He stared at Clara, searching her eyes for a flicker of deception, but found only a mixture of fear and resignation, a silent plea for understanding. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat, choked by a paralyzing sense of disbelief. The carefully constructed world he had known shattered into a million pieces, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty. A victim of a betrayal he couldn't comprehend, a future irrevocably altered by a single, devastating revelation. The weight of the truth pressing down on him, suffocating his hope. His parents' reaction was not one of shock or concern, but of subtle relief, a barely perceptible shift in their demeanor that confirmed his worst fears. They embraced Clara, offering words of comfort and support, while casting sidelong glances at Elias. Glances that spoke volumes, a silent acknowledgement of Julian's role in the pregnancy. His father's hand rested on Julian's shoulder, a gesture of approval that felt like a dagger to Elias's heart. His mother's voice, usually crisp and controlled, softened as she spoke to Clara, praising her strength and resilience, a praise that felt like a condemnation of Elias's perceived weakness. He attempted to voice his concerns, to demand an explanation, but his words were met with dismissive platitudes and veiled accusations. They accused him of being selfish, of prioritizing his own feelings over Clara's happiness, of disrupting the family harmony. A harmony that had always been built on a foundation of lies and deception. He realized with a sickening clarity that his parents had already made their choice, a choice that favored Julian, a choice that effectively erased Elias from the equation, a choice that left him feeling utterly alone and betrayed. The decision felt less like a choice and more like a surrender, a silent agreement forged in the crucible of family pressure and societal expectations. Elias watched as Clara and Julian began to build a life together, a life that was built on a foundation of deceit, a life that was funded by his parents' unwavering support. He retreated into himself, immersing himself in his work, seeking solace in the precision of architectural design, the tangible results of his efforts a temporary escape. From the emotional turmoil that consumed him, he avoided family gatherings, unable to bear the sight of Clara and Julian's fabricated happiness, unable to endure the condescending smiles and veiled accusations from his parents. He felt like an outsider, a ghost haunting the periphery of his own life, a victim of a betrayal he couldn't fight, a future irrevocably altered by a choice that wasn't his to make. The weight of his grief and resentment pressing down on him, suffocating his hope. A silent resignation settling over him, a quiet acceptance of his fate. For years blurred into a monotonous cycle of work and solitude, Elias had built a successful career, establishing himself as a respected architect. His designs were praised for their innovation and elegance, a testament to his talent and dedication. Yet even in his professional achievements, a sense of emptiness lingered, a void that couldn't be filled by accolades or recognition. He had deliberately distanced himself from his family, limiting his interactions to brief, perfunctory phone calls. He avoided any mention of Clara or Julian, refusing to acknowledge their existence, a self-imposed exile that offered a temporary reprieve from the pain. He had learned to compartmentalize his emotions, to bury his grief beneath a veneer of stoicism, a survival mechanism that allowed him to function. But at the cost of genuine connection, he occasionally caught glimpses of Clara and Julian in social media posts, images of a seemingly happy family, a perfect facade that belied the underlying truth, a truth that he carried within him, a silent burden that weighed heavily on his soul. A subtle shift in the family dynamic began to unfold, a series of cracks appearing in the carefully constructed facade of Julian and Clara's happiness. Elias noticed a growing tension between them during a rare family gathering, a strained politeness that masked a deeper resentment. Clara's smile seemed forced, her eyes lacking their usual sparkle, while Julian appeared withdrawn and irritable, snapping at his son, a small boy who bore a striking resemblance to Elias, a resemblance that seemed to irritate Julian. Elias observed these interactions with a detached curiosity, a sense of morbid fascination. He no longer felt any personal stake in their happiness, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, a quiet vindication that their carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel, a premonition that the consequences of their actions were finally catching up to them. a subtle tremor that foreshadowed a larger earthquake, a sense of impending doom that hung heavy in the air. The news arrived like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile peace that Elias had painstakingly constructed. Julian had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. The prognosis was grim. The doctors offered little hope. Elias felt a complex mix of emotions: shock, disbelief, and a strange sense of detachment. He had spent years distancing himself from Julian, building a wall of resentment and indifference. And now, faced with his brother's impending mortality, he found himself struggling to reconcile his past grievances with his present feelings. He visited Julian in the hospital, a reluctant gesture of familial obligation. The room was sterile and cold, filled with the beeping of machines and the scent of antiseptic. Julian looked gaunt and frail, his once vibrant energy extinguished, his eyes filled with a haunting sadness. They spoke little, the conversation stilted and awkward, a lifetime of unspoken resentments hanging between them, a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Elias left the hospital feeling emotionally drained, a sense of unease lingering in his mind, a premonition that this was not the end of the story. Clara's strength began to crumble under the weight of Julian's illness, the initial stoicism giving way to a raw and desperate vulnerability. She struggled to cope with the demands of caregiving, the endless hospital visits, the constant fear and uncertainty. Elias observed her from a distance, offering practical support but maintaining an emotional distance. He couldn't bring himself to offer comfort, to bridge the gap that had been created by years of betrayal. He saw the resentment simmering beneath the surface, the unspoken accusations directed at Julian, and by extension, at himself. She confided in him, sharing her fears and frustrations, her voice trembling with exhaustion. She admitted to feeling trapped, suffocated by the responsibility, a prisoner of a life she hadn't chosen. Elias listened in silence, offering only a sympathetic nod, unable to offer the solace she desperately needed. A sense of guilt gnawing at him, a realization that he was complicit in her suffering, a silent witness to her slow and agonizing descent. Drawn back into the family orbit by a sense of reluctant obligation, Elias found himself unexpectedly thrust into the role of caregiver, assisting Clara with Julian's medical appointments and providing emotional support to his parents. The house, once a symbol of curated perfection, now felt chaotic and oppressive, filled with the scent of illness and the weight of unspoken grief. He navigated the complex dynamics with a practiced detachment, offering practical assistance while carefully guarding his emotions. He observed his parents, their carefully constructed facade crumbling under the strain, their unwavering devotion to Julian now tinged with fear and regret. He saw the toll that Julian's illness was taking on Clara, her spirit broken, her eyes devoid of hope. He found himself drawn to her, a flicker of empathy igniting within him, a desire to offer comfort, to bridge the gap that had been created by years of betrayal. But he hesitated, afraid of rekindling old wounds, afraid of opening himself up to further pain, a silent struggle raging within him, a conflict between his past resentments and his present compassion. Through fragmented conversations with Clara and his parents, Elias began to piece together the events leading up to the pregnancy, a complex web of unspoken desires and hidden motivations. Clara revealed that she had been deeply attracted to Julian, drawn to his charisma and confidence, a vulnerability that Elias had never suspected. She admitted to feeling neglected by him, yearning for his attention, a desire that had been subtly exploited by Julian, his parents, in their relentless pursuit of appearances, had encouraged the relationship, seeing Julian as the ideal heir to their legacy. Elias listened in silence, his heart aching with a mixture of grief and understanding. The truth was far more nuanced than he had imagined, a tangled mess of emotions and circumstances that defied simple explanations. He realized that he had been blinded by his own insecurities, his own sense of inadequacy, failing to see the complexities of Clara's heart, failing to recognize the subtle manipulations of his parents, a painful realization that shattered his long-held beliefs. Julian's decline was swift and relentless, his body ravaged by the disease, his spirit broken. The hospital room became a sanctuary of sorrow, filled with the hushed whispers of family members and the rhythmic beeping of machines. Elias spent hours at his brother's bedside, offering silent companionship, a gesture of forgiveness that felt both cathartic and hollow. He listened to Julian's rambling confessions, his regrets and apologies. His voice barely a whisper. He learned of Julian's own insecurities, his own struggles with parental expectations, a revelation that humanized him, stripping away the veneer of perfection. He realized that Julian had been as much a victim of their parents' machinations as he had been a pawn in a game of power and control, a realization that brought him a measure of peace, a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. The weight of his resentment finally beginning to lift. The silence that descended after Julian's death was deafening, a void that echoed through the halls of the family home. The funeral was a somber affair, attended by a small circle of friends and family. Elias stood beside Clara, offering a silent gesture of support, their hands brushing briefly, a fleeting moment of connection that spoke volumes. His parents, consumed by grief, retreated into themselves, their carefully constructed facade finally shattered, revealing the fragility beneath. The house felt empty and desolate, stripped of its former grandeur, a monument to a lost illusion. Elias wandered through the rooms, revisiting memories of his childhood, a sense of melancholy washing over him. He realized that the house had never been a home, but a prison, a gilded cage that had confined them all, a realization that liberated him, a sense of freedom that he hadn't felt in years. Clara's grief manifested in a quiet resignation, a withdrawal from the world. She spent her days tending to their son, a bright and inquisitive boy who bore a striking resemblance to Elias, a resemblance that served as a constant reminder of the past. She rarely spoke, her eyes filled with a haunting sadness. Elias found himself drawn to her, offering practical assistance and emotional support. He began to see her not as the woman who had betrayed him, but as a fellow victim of circumstance, a woman who had been trapped by her own desires and the manipulations of others. He shared his own vulnerabilities with her, his own regrets and insecurities, a tentative connection forming between them, a fragile bridge spanning the chasm of their past. He realized that forgiveness was not about condoning their actions, but about releasing himself from the burden of resentment, about finding a way to move forward, about building a future free from the shadows of the past, a fragile peace that was hard-earned, but ultimately worth fighting for, a testament to the enduring power of love and resilience. Subscribe this channel and like with comment. Backhand index pointing down. Watch the full story to see what happened next. Backhand index pointing down.